Chrome reflects mistakes with perfect clarity. A deep gouge across a custom gas tank isn't just vandalism, it is a signature of entitlement. Richard left his mark on a Hells Angels Harley on a sunny Tuesday. By dawn, 500 roaring engines came to return the favor. Richard hated the smell of roasted coffee beans. It was too sharp, too earthy. He preferred the sterile, filtered air of his high-rise office, or the leather-scented vacuum of his Porsche. But his assistant had messed up his morning schedule, forcing him to kill 20 minutes in an upscale suburban enclave outside San Francisco. He stood on the sidewalk, a $50 pastry in a paper bag, crinkling in his grip. The sun was hot, beating down on the asphalt, making the air shimmer above the parked cars. Richard was sweating through his bespoke linen shirt. He was 52, carrying an extra 15 pounds around his waist that no personal trainer seemed able to banish, and he was profoundly irritated. He walked toward his pristine, midnight blue Panamera. That was when he saw it. A motorcycle. Not a sleek, quiet, electric bike, but a massive, sprawling piece of heavy machinery. It was parked diagonally, its kickstand resting on a crushed soda can to keep it from sinking into the soft summer asphalt. The bike was entirely matte black, devoid of chrome, looking less like a vehicle and more like a blunt instrument of violence. It smelled of hot oil exhaust and road grime. Worse, it was parked mere inches from Richard's driver's side door. Richard stopped. He stared at the gap between the motorcycle's handlebars and his Porsche. Maybe 6 inches. He would have to squeeze suck in his gut and risk brushing his slacks against the greasy exhaust pipe just to get inside his own property. A tight, hot knot of anger formed in his chest. It wasn't about the inconvenience, it was about the audacity. Richard spent his entire life paying millions of dollars to ensure he never had to squeeze past anyone or anything. He bought airspace, he bought private lanes, he bought distance. He glanced around. The street was relatively quiet. A woman walking a golden retriever a block away. A delivery driver absorbed in his phone. Richard's hand slipped into his tailored pocket. His fingers found the heavy, brushed tungsten key to his front gate. It was a cold, sharp object. He didn't think about it. He didn't weigh the moral implications or the potential consequences. His mind was entirely occupied by a childish, petulant fury. Trash, he thought. Inconsiderate trash. He stepped into the narrow gap. He squeezed past the bike, feeling the heat radiating from its engine block against his thigh. As he reached his door, he pressed the tungsten key against the motorcycle's matte black gas tank. He pushed hard. He dragged it backward. The sound was sickening. It wasn't a clean slice. It was a jagged, stuttering screech of metal, biting into metal, scraping away layers of paint and primer down to the bare steel. It sounded like teeth grinding on a stone. The vibration traveled up Richard's arm, sending a weird, unpleasant thrill through his shoulder. He left a ragged silver scar 2 feet long across the black tank. Richard unlocked his car, his breathing suddenly shallow. A rush of adrenaline, sharp and metallic, hit the back of his throat. He felt alive. He felt powerful. Then he looked up. Standing in the doorway of the bakery, a cardboard cup of coffee in his hand, was the owner. He wasn't a caricature. He wasn't screaming or waving his arms. He was a man in his late 40s, built like a brick wall, wearing faded Levi's and a heavy leather vest over a black t-shirt. The vest was worn smooth at the edges. On the back, partially obscured by the angle, but unmistakably clear, was the winged death head. The top rocker read, Hell's Angels. The bottom rocker read, California. Richard froze. His hand was still on the door handle of his Porsche. The biker didn't move. He didn't drop his coffee. He just looked at the silver scar on his tank, and then his eyes drifted up to meet Richard's. There was no rage in the man's face. That was what terrified Richard the most. The biker's expression was flat, analytical, and entirely empty of surprise. He looked at Richard the way a butcher looks at a side of beef, calculating the weight, the effort, the eventual mess. Richard scrambled. He practically fell into the driver's seat, slamming the heavy German door shut. The hermetic seal of the luxury car cut off the street noise, instantly leaving him in suffocating silence. His hands were shaking so badly he struggled to hit the ignition button. He threw the car into drive and peeled out the tires, chirping on the hot pavement. He checked his rearview mirror constantly. The biker hadn't moved. He just stood there on the sidewalk, sipping his coffee, watching the Porsche disappear down the avenue. By the time Richard reached the highway, the adrenaline had soured into a hollow, gnawing nausea. He cranked the air conditioning, shivering, despite the sweat pooling at the small of his back. "It's fine," Richard muttered aloud, his voice sounding thin and pathetic in the quiet cabin. "He didn't get my plates. He doesn't know me. It's fine." He spent the rest of the day in his office, completely unable to focus on the quarterly reports, blinking on his monitors. Every time a truck rumbled past the building, his heart spiked. He cancelled his afternoon meetings. He drank 3 glasses of scotch from his private cabinet before 4 p.m., trying to dull the sharp edges of his anxiety. He kept telling himself he was Richard Gable. He lived in a gated estate in the hills. He had security. He was a man of means, insulated from the gritty, unwashed reality of the streets. A scratched motorcycle was a matter for police, for insurance, for lawyers. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw that flat, dead stare. The stare of a man who didn't use lawyers. Richard lived in a fortress of glass and limestone, perched on a ridge overlooking the valley. The property was surrounded by a 10-foot wrought iron fence, monitored by 8 high-definition cameras, and accessible only through a heavy steel gate that required a biometric scan. He arrived home as the sun was setting, the sky bruising into shades of purple and black. He fired his housekeeper for the evening, wanting to be entirely alone. He locked all the doors. He armed the security system. He closed the automated blackout blinds, plunging the massive echoing house into artificial darkness. Dinner was a slice of cold pizza he couldn't taste, and another 2 fingers of scotch. He paced the length of his living room, his bare feet slapping against the heated marble floors. "Paranoia," he whispered to the empty room. "You're being ridiculous." He went to bed at midnight, exhausted but completely wired. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the absolute silence of his estate. The silence was usually a comfort, a luxury he paid dearly for. Tonight it felt oppressive. It felt like holding your breath underwater. He finally drifted into a thin, restless sleep around 2 a.m. He woke up at 3:14 a.m. He didn't wake up because of a noise. He woke up because of a feeling. It started in his teeth, a microscopic vibration, a dull ache in his jaw. Then he felt it in the mattress, a low, continuous hum. Richard sat up, the heavy Egyptian cotton sheets pooling around his waist. He was sweating again. He looked at the glass of water on his nightstand. The surface of the water was rippling in tiny, concentric circles. Earthquake, he thought instinctively. It was California after all, but the vibration didn't stop, and it didn't violently shake the house. It just droned on a deep, resonant frequency that seemed to bypass his ears and sink directly into his bones. Then came the smell. Richard's home had a state-of-the-art HVAC system, with HEPA filters meant to scrub the air of pollen, smoke, and impurities. But the smell bypassed the filters entirely. It seeped under the bedroom door. The thick, acrid stench of unburned gasoline, hot metal and exhaust fumes. Richard's stomach plummeted. The nausea returned, hitting him so hard he almost retched over the side of the bed. He threw off the covers and stumbled to the window. His fingers fumbled with the control panel on the wall. He hit the button to raise the blackout blinds. The heavy fabric slowly rolled upward with a mechanical whir. Richard pressed his hands against the cold, bullet-resistant glass and looked down at his property. The security gate at the bottom of his long, winding driveway was gone. Not opened. Gone. Torn entirely off its hinges, lying flat on the manicured grass. And the driveway was full. Headlights pierced the fog that had rolled in off the bay. Dozens of them. Hundreds of them. They were parked in perfect militant rows, filling the quarter-mile stretch of asphalt from the ruined gate all the way up to his front steps. They spilled over onto the perfect green lawns, their heavy tires sinking into the imported turf. Motorcycles. There were no flashing police lights. There were no sirens. There was only the collective deafening idle of 500 V-twin engines. It was a mechanical heartbeat, a low, guttural roar that shook the heavy panes of glass Richard was leaning against. He couldn't breathe. His lungs refused to expand. Under the ambient glow of his outdoor security lighting, he could see the riders. They were still sitting on their bikes. 500 men in leather and denim. 500 white patches glowing faintly in the dark. Hell's Angels. They weren't throwing rocks. They weren't shouting. They weren't trying to break down his front door. They were just sitting there, idling, waiting. Richard backed away from the window, his legs suddenly weak. He tripped over a rug and fell hard onto the floor, scraping his knee against the marble. He didn't feel the pain. He scrambled backward like a crab until his back hit the frame of his bed. He grabbed his phone from the nightstand. His hands were shaking so violently he dropped it twice. He finally managed to unlock it and dialed 911. He held the phone to his ear, listening to the ring. Ring, ring, ring. 911, what is your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. They're here. Richard choked out his voice, cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. There are hundreds of them, outside my house. You need to send the police. Send everyone. Sir, calm down. Who is outside your house? What is your address? Richard rattled off his address, tripping over the numbers. Bikers. Hell's Angels. They broke my gate. They're surrounding my house. There was a pause on the line. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. Sir, the dispatcher said, her tone shifting slightly. Are they actively trying to enter your residence? No, they're just sitting there, but there are hundreds of them. Listen. Richard held the phone up toward the window. Even through the thick glass, the low rumble of the engines was audible. We have units in the area, sir, the dispatcher said. But we've received reports of a massive gathering blocking the canyon roads leading up to your neighborhood. It's a logistical issue. The roads are completely impassable. We are staging units at the bottom of the hill. Staging, Richard shrieked. What do you mean staging? Get up here. Sir, lock your doors. Do not engage with them. We will get there as soon as the road is clear. The line went dead. Richard dropped the phone. The police weren't coming, at least not any time soon. The bikers hadn't just surrounded his house. They had choked off the only artery leading up the mountain. He was entirely, fundamentally alone. He sat on the floor of his bedroom, pulling his knees to his chest. He was a millionaire. He was a CEO. He was a man who moved numbers on screens and ruined careers with a signature. But right now, sitting in the dark, while his house vibrated to the rhythm of 500 engines, he was just prey. He realized with a sickening clarity the mistake he had made. He had keyed that bike not out of anger, but out of a desperate need to prove he had power over his environment. And the universe had responded by sending an army to show him exactly how little power he actually possessed. The low rumble continued. It didn't fluctuate. It was patient. It was the sound of inevitable consequences idling right outside his door. The house felt like the inside of a snare drum. The relentless, overlapping drone of the V-twin engines rattled the expensive bone china in the kitchen cabinets. It was a frequency that bypassed the ears and settled directly in the gut. Richard pressed his palms flat against the cool marble of his master bathroom counter, leaning hard over the sink. He stared at his reflection in the mirror. His face was grey, his hair, usually locked in place with expensive, imported pomade, stood up in erratic, sweaty tufts. He looked incredibly old. He looked soft. He left the bathroom and crept downstairs. He didn't dare turn on any lights. He navigated the sprawling floor plan by the ambient toxic orange glow of the security halogens seeping through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The exhaust fumes were thicker down here. They pooled in the lower levels of the house, coating the back of his throat with a heavy metallic tang. It smelled like a highway accident. He walked to the back of the house toward the sunroom that overlooked his infinity pool. He pressed his back against the wall and carefully peeled back the very edge of a heavy silk curtain. They were back there too. Dozens of heavy cruisers were parked directly on the imported Italian tiling. Black oil dripped from hot engine blocks onto the pristine, porous stone, leaving permanent dark stains. A man with a thick, unkempt grey beard sat on a low-slung, customized chopper, casually smoking a cigarette. The cherry of the cigarette flared bright orange in the dark, briefly illuminating the heavy silver rings covering his fingers. The man didn't look at the house. He didn't seem to care that Richard was watching. He just stared out over the valley, blowing grey smoke into the crisp mountain air. Richard dropped the curtain. The fabric felt heavy, useless. There was no back way out. He was entirely penned in. He stumbled away from the windows and moved into his study. He walked around the heavy oak desk and opened the bottom drawer. Inside rested a 9mm Glock he had purchased a decade ago, right after a highly publicized break-in down the street. He had never fired it. He didn't even know if the ammunition in the magazine was still good. He picked it up. The steel was freezing. It felt absurd in his trembling, manicured hand. He pictured himself walking out the front door, pointing this cold piece of metal at 500 men who wore violence like a second skin. If he fired a shot, if he even brandished the weapon, he wouldn't survive the next 60 seconds. They would tear him apart on his own lawn. He dropped the gun back into the drawer and slammed it shut. He needed something else. He needed an out. He needed to apologize. He needed to buy his way out just like he always did. A check. He scrambled across the desk, pulling open a side drawer. He grabbed his leather-bound checkbook. His pen scratched violently across the paper in the dark as he wrote out $50,000. Then he stopped, his breathing shallow and rapid. He crossed the numbers out and frantically wrote 100,000. He ripped the check from the ledger and stuffed the paper deep into the pocket of his silk robe. Then the noise changed. It didn't fade away. It cut out, in a rolling, synchronized wave, starting from the ruined front gate at the bottom of the hill and moving up the driveway. The engines died. It took about 10 seconds for all 500 bikes to completely shut down. The sudden silence was a physical blow. It sucked the air out of the room. The only sound left in the canyon was the sharp, metallic pinging of hundreds of exhaust pipes cooling down in the damp night air. Ping, ping, tink. It sounded like a countdown. Richard stood frozen in the foyer. The massive mahogany front door loomed ahead of him, an impenetrable barrier that suddenly felt like paper. He knew they were waiting. The silence was a demand. They weren't going to break down the door. They didn't need to. They were going to make him open it. He walked forward, his bare feet dragged against the hardwood floor. He reached out and unlocked the deadbolt. The heavy metallic click echoed loudly in the empty foyer. He grabbed the heavy brass handle. His palm was slick with cold sweat. He turned it, leaned his weight back and pulled the door open. Damp California fog immediately breached the threshold, carrying a suffocating, almost chewable wave of burned rubber, hot grease and unwashed leather. It poured over the pristine hardwood of the foyer like a toxic tide. Richard stepped out onto the wide stone porch, reality fractured. A sea of black leather, dull chrome and heavy denim stretched across the entirety of his multi-million-dollar property. 500 men stood beside their idling machines. Nobody spoke. Nobody checked a phone. Nobody shifted their weight or whispered to their neighbor. They all just looked at him. The collective weight of their stare was a physical pressure pressing down heavily on Richard's sternum, making his ribs ache as they struggled to expand. It was a terrifying display of absolute discipline. Richard was accustomed to corporate aggression, shouting matches in boardrooms, aggressive legal filings, red-faced executives slamming palms on mahogany tables. This was different. This was the cold, patient silence of an apex predator, watching a wounded animal bleed out, his hand buried deep in the pocket of his expensive silk robe, clamped around the crumpled check. His knuckles ground together. In his world, paper solved everything. Paper built walls. Paper silenced accusations. Paper erased mistakes. He desperately rubbed the smooth edge of the check with his thumb, trying to draw some sort of magical protection from the numbers inked on it. The crowd directly in front of the porch steps parted. There was no command given. They simply shifted leather groaning against leather, creating a narrow, perfectly straight aisle through the mass of bodies and machines. A single figure walked forward. Heavy boots crunched slowly on the crushed grey gravel Richard had imported at an exorbitant cost from a quarry in southern France. It was the man from the bakery. He walked deliberately, his thumbs hooked casually into the front pockets of his faded, grease-stained jeans. He didn't look angry. He didn't look vengeful or triumphant. He looked profoundly bored. He stopped at the very bottom of the porch steps and stared up. Richard was shivering uncontrollably now, his bare calves vibrating under the hem of his robe. Richard started. His voice was a dry, scraping croak that barely carried past the first row of bikes. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking loudly in the oppressive quiet. He tried again. "I have money." The words hung in the fog, sounding incredibly pathetic, even to his own ears. "I can pay for the tank." Richard babbled the dam, breaking his voice, rising in pitch. "I can buy you a brand new bike, the exact same model. I can cut a check right now to cover everyone's time tonight. Whatever the club needs, a donation." He pulled the crumpled check from his pocket. His arm extended outward, rigid and shaking so violently the paper rattled. The biker didn't look at the check. He didn't even blink. He took one step up. The wooden stair groaned under his heavy boot. Then another step. Richard instinctively recoiled. His bare heel caught on the raised brass threshold of his front door. He stumbled backward, his arms windmilling for a second before he caught his balance, his breathing hitching in a wet, ragged gasp. The biker stopped on the top step, his boots planted squarely on the imported grey slate, mere inches from Richard. The smell of him was intense, an olfactory assault completely alien to Richard's sanitized, HEPA-filtered life. It was a potent mixture of stale black coffee, old tobacco damp denim, and the sharp chemical bite of machine oil. Up close, beneath the harsh clinical glare of the LED porch light, Richard saw the deep, weathered lines cutting through the man's face. He saw the thick, pale ridges of scar tissue stretched tight over his knuckles. He saw the frayed edges of the California rocker stitched onto the heavy leather vest. The biker slowly pulled his right hand from his pocket. Richard flinched violently. He squeezed his eyes shut and turned his head away, throwing his left arm up to protect his face. Every muscle in his body braced for the slide of a knife, the cold, hard barrel of a gun pressing against his temple, or the crushing, blinding impact of a leather-clad fist. His heart hammered furiously against his ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. Nothing hit him. Instead, a small, sharp metallic clink sounded on the stone porch down at his bare feet. Richard kept his eyes squeezed shut for another 2 agonizing seconds. When no blow came, he slowly opened them and lowered his arm. He looked down. Resting on the wet grey slate was his heavy, brushed tungsten gate key. The tip of the metal was scuffed, deeply marred, with a thick, transferred smear of matte black paint. It was the key he had dragged across the Harley's tank. They hadn't just followed him. They had found the exact instrument of his petty vandalism, likely dropped in his frantic rush to escape, and brought it back. It was a message of terrifying omniscience. Richard slowly dragged his gaze upward. The biker wasn't looking at him anymore. He was looking past Richard, peering directly into the cavernous, immaculate foyer of the mansion. He took his time, his eyes sweeping over the massive crystal chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling. The sweeping modern glass staircase, the pristine, art-free white walls, and the utter echoing emptiness of the massive space. There were no family photos. There was no warmth. It was a sterile museum built for one. "Nice house," the biker said. His voice was gravel-low and grating in the damp air. It didn't hold a shred of intimidation. It didn't hold anger. It held a deep, hollow pity. He turned his back on Richard and walked slowly down the steps. He approached his massive, blacked-out Harley. He threw his heavy leg over the saddle and reached for the ignition switch. The engine fired instantly, a deafening, violent crack that tore through the fog like a gunshot. As if connected by an invisible electric wire, 500 hands hit their starters in perfect unison. The canyon erupted. The sound was a physical wall pushing brutally against Richard's face, rattling the expensive dental work inside his skull. The sheer volume was disorienting, a mechanical roar that drowned out everything else in the world. The biker kicked his machine into gear and slowly rolled forward. He didn't use the driveway. He aimed his front tire directly onto the pristine, imported turf of the front lawn. The army followed. They didn't rev their engines aggressively. They didn't speed off into the night to show off. They moved at a punishing, methodical crawl. 500 heavy machines rolled directly over the manicured landscaping. Heavy treaded tires dug deep, permanent trenches into the soft earth. They crushed the hidden, expensive sprinkler heads, popping them like plastic knuckles under their weight. They shattered the low-voltage pathway lights, grinding the glass and metal into the mud. They left massive, overlapping ruts of wet dirt and torn grass in their wake, turning a $1 million lawn into a churned, ruined battlefield. Richard stood completely paralyzed on the porch. He watched them parade away, a slow-moving, unstoppable river of metal leather and exhaust. It took 20 grueling minutes for the very last bike to roll over the crushed remains of his front gate. When the red tail lights finally bled out into the dark fog and vanished down the winding mountain road, the silence slowly returned to the estate. But it wasn't the luxurious, paid-for silence of his old life. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet. It was the sound of a man who realized that despite his bank accounts, his gated walls, and his tungsten keys, he owned absolutely nothing that mattered. Richard looked down at the scratched metal key resting on the cold stone. He didn't reach for it. His legs finally gave out. He sank slowly to his knees, the freezing wet slate biting sharply through his thin silk robe. He stared out at the ruined, muddy expanse of his property. The acrid stench of raw gasoline lingered heavily in the expensive curtains behind him, a smell that he knew with absolute, terrifying certainty would never truly wash out. If this dark, grounded story of entitlement and brutal reality kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button right now. Your support tells the algorithm to push this video to more listeners who crave intense, deeply human storytelling. Don't forget to share this with friends who appreciate a raw narrative, and subscribe to the channel for more gripping, immersive audio dramas delivered every single week. Please leave a comment below with your honest thoughts today